This video is brought to you by Brilliant. On Tuesday, President-elect Donald Trump announced the creation of a new Department of Government Efficiency to be headed up by Tesla CEO Elon Musk and former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. In a post on Truth Social, Trump suggested the new department would partner with the White House Office of Budget and Management, or OMB, to trim down government spending, suggesting it could even become the Manhattan Project of our time. This was actually something Musk talked about a fair bit during the latter stages of the campaign, and his stated plans are ambitious. During a campaign rally in New York last month, he claimed he wanted to trim $2 trillion off the $7 trillion federal budget, which, if it happened, would push the US into its first budget surplus since 2001. Originally, it was unclear what sort of timeline Musk was imagining here, but Trump's announcement said that the department's work would be done no later than July 4th, 2026, which means Musk has basically 18 months to do what he can. So in this video, we're going to have a look at Musk's Javier Milei-style plan to trim down the American state, and whether he can actually succeed. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start by explaining why the US might need to trim down the federal government. When Musk talks about why he thinks the US needs a Department of Government Efficiency, he broadly gives two reasons. The first is that America is, in his words, going bankrupt. In other words, the federal government is spending a lot more money than it takes in, which means America's national debt is now reaching unsustainable levels. In the 2024 fiscal year, which runs between October 2023 and September 2024, the US ran a deficit of $1.83 trillion. This equates to about 6.4% of GDP, which is an absolutely enormous number by peacetime standards. For context, over the past 50 years, the US deficit has averaged about 3.8%, and the only other time the US has run a deficit this large was in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis and during the pandemic. Successive and rising deficits mean that the US national debt has risen to over 120% of GDP, according to Federal Reserve data. These are pretty scary numbers by themselves, but things have been made quite a lot worse by the recent rise in interest rates. Not only does this mean that fresh borrowing is more expensive, but it also means that servicing pre-existing debt, i.e. paying interest payments on the tens of trillions of dollars of outstanding debt, accounts for an ever-growing fraction of government revenues. According to the IMF, debt servicing costs now account for over 15% of all US government spending, nearly triple the G7 average. This means the US is spending more on interest payments than on defense or Medicare. The worry here is that the US gets caught in a sort of debt servicing spiral, whereby the US has to borrow more and more money to service its debt, but this means more debt, so more debt servicing, which forces more borrowing ad infinitum. On top of all this, Trump's fiscal plans, which include massive tax cuts, will probably make things a lot worse. The non-partisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget explains that his stated policies would add another $8 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years, pushing the deficit up to 10% of GDP. There's also the risk that the US gets caught in another vicious cycle, as sustained government spending stokes inflation, which discourages the Federal Reserve from cutting interest rates, which means more spending in the form of higher debt servicing costs. Anyway, that's the first reason. Musk worries that, without significant cuts in government spending, the federal government is at risk of going bankrupt. But the second reason Musk often gives is his belief that excessive regulation and government bureaucracy stymies economic growth. Musk therefore believes that if he can successfully reduce government waste, he'll be able to bring America's debt-to-GDP ratio down by both decreasing the numerator and increasing the denominator. In other words, reducing borrowing and increasing GDP. In the same vein, Musk also believes that a lot of government spending is wasteful, spent employing people to do useless things, or even nothing, when they could otherwise be doing productive work in the private sector. Although it's worth noting that, while there's obviously going to be some wasteful spending in a $7 trillion budget, the US actually has a pretty small state by international standards. According to the most recent IMF data, for instance, government spending amounted to 37.5% of GDP in 2024, by far and away the lowest in the G7. So that's why Musk wants to cut down the American state. But can he actually do it? Well, cutting $2 trillion off the budget before mid-2026 would be immensely difficult and would almost definitely require cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and the defense budget. Cuts to these big government programs require congressional approval, and even though Republicans have majorities in both the House and Senate, this doesn't mean he'll be able to get these cuts through. Last month, for instance, Republican Senator Rand Paul proposed a bill that would cut spending by 6% a year, every year, until the US budget is balanced. But it was voted down by a 56-39 majority, which included Republican hawks who didn't want to see defense spending cut. It was for this reason that Trump failed to cut spending on Affordable Care Act insurance subsidies in his first term, along with other agency cuts. Musk and Trump could instead target so-called discretionary spending, outlays that are not permanently enshrined in law but have to be voted on every year by Congress. Discretionary spending accounted for about $1.7 trillion in 2023, but about half of that went on defense, and much of it is spent on paying federal salaries. Ultimately, cutting the federal budget by 30% in 18 months would be immensely painful however Musk does it, and the only place anyone has tried anything remotely similar is Argentina, where President Javier Milei has cut the federal budget by 35% in just a year, shutting down 13 government ministries and sacking about 10% of all civil servants. But while Milei's plans have sort of worked, the government ran a monthly budget surplus for the first time earlier this year, they've also triggered a deep recession, with GDP shrinking by about 3% this year and the poverty rate now above 50%. While this is something Musk has been remarkably candid about, admitting in a virtual town hall on X that his planned reductions would, quote, necessarily involve some temporary hardship, Trump might not be so keen on it, given he's the one who'll suffer the political repercussions. It's also worth saying that this is where the Argentina analogy collapses. Argentinian voters elected Milei knowing that they were asking for some short-term pain, whereas Trump campaigned promising an immediate economic boom with tax cuts and lower inflation. Now, as a TLDR viewer, it's clear that you have a thirst for learning. After all, why else would you have watched a 10-minute video explaining what Musk's new department is? Now, if you want to continue your learning journey, you really should check out Brilliant. Brilliant is the online learning platform where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. These hands-on lessons have you comparing circuits to understand voltage and current, playing snooker to learn the rules of collision, planning your itinerary for an intergalactic music festival on a space-time diagram, and more. That way you'll build your natural intuition while gaining deep knowledge of scientific principles. In fact, Brilliant actually recently launched tons of new data science content, all of which uses real-world data to help you see trends and make better informed decisions. And don't worry, you don't need to be a world-renowned scientist to understand these courses either. Brilliant's courses are designed for learners of any level. Find out more and to try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/TLDR or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support and thanks to Brilliant for supporting this video.